What do you do when the jungle goes silent? Not quiet, silent. No birds, no insects, no wind through the elephant grass. Just your own breathing and the diesel rumble of 6 M113 armored personnel carriers grinding down Highway 13 at 15 miles per hour. You're 24 years old. You command 37 men. The enemy has been studying you for months, learning your patterns, waiting for this exact moment. You have 3 seconds to decide. Turn back and risk court-martial for cowardice. Push forward into what every instinct screams is a trap. Or stop here and become a stationary target. First Lieutenant Michael "Doc" Holloway from Amarillo, Texas, felt sweat running down his spine despite the early morning cold. 4 months in country with the Blackhorse Regiment. 23 patrols. 0 contact. His men called him Doc because he'd been pre-med before OCS, because he carried extra medical supplies, because he'd held Private Jenkins together after the landmine until the medevac arrived. The photo of his wife Sarah was taped to the dashboard of his command track. She'd made him promise to come home. Not to be a hero, just to come home. He'd promised. Something wasn't right. He'd heard something 3 seconds ago. Not a sound. The absence of sound. Like the jungle itself had stopped breathing. What it meant, he wouldn't understand until it was too late. If you're watching this, you recognize that military history isn't just about tactics and technology. It's about men who executed impossible missions under conditions that would break most people. This channel exists to tell their stories with the accuracy and respect they deserve, without glorifying war or simplifying the choices they faced. These were real men making real decisions with real consequences. Subscribe now and join those who refuse to let these experiences fade into footnotes. Because what happened next on Highway 13 would prove that courage and firepower mean nothing without the will to use them.
Michael Holloway hadn't planned on the Army. He'd planned on medical school, on following his father into general practice in Amarillo, on a life where the hardest decision was which patient to see first. But medical school cost money his family didn't have, and the draft notice arrived 3 weeks after his college deferment ended. He could have run to Canada. 3 guys from his graduating class did. Instead, he enlisted, took the OCS option, figured he'd serve his time as a medical officer. The Army had different plans. They saw his ASVAB scores, his physics degree, his ability to stay calm when everyone else panicked. They made him a cavalry officer. 6 months later, he was leading a platoon of M113s through a jungle on the other side of the world, responsible for men whose names he'd barely learned before they started calling him Doc. His father had served in Korea, never talked about it. Michael understood why now. Some things don't translate to people who weren't there. The weight of knowing that every decision you make might kill someone. The exhaustion that goes beyond physical, that settles into your bones and stays there. The way you stop seeing faces and start seeing tactical problems that need solving. He'd written his wife every day for the first 2 months, then every other day, then twice a week. Not because he loved her less, because he was becoming someone she wouldn't recognize, and he didn't know how to explain that in a letter. The 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment, Blackhorse, had a reputation that preceded it: fast, aggressive, unforgiving. They'd been in Vietnam since 1966, operating primarily in the border regions where Cambodia's sanctuary made every patrol a gamble. The Viet Cong and NVA used those borders like a shield, hitting American positions and disappearing before air support could respond. Blackhorse's job was to find them, fix them, and destroy them before they could fade back across the border. It was a mission designed by people who'd never walked a jungle trail with an RPG aimed at their chest. Highway 13, Thunder Road, the men called it, ran from Saigon north through Binh Long Province, a critical supply route that the Viet Cong wanted closed and the Americans needed open. Both sides understood what it represented: control. The Americans needed it to supply fire support bases. The Viet Cong needed it shut down to prove they could operate wherever they wanted. Men died over asphalt and dirt. That's what it came down to. Holloway's platoon had drawn the patrol nobody wanted. Intelligence reported increased VC activity along the southern stretch, near where the jungle pressed close to both sides of the highway. Command wanted a show of force. Roll through in strength. Let them see American armor. Let them think twice about an ambush. It was the kind of thinking that looked good on a map in Saigon and felt like suicide on the ground. He hadn't told his men about the intelligence reports, hadn't mentioned that 2 ARVN patrols had disappeared on this same route in the past month. What good would it do except make them more scared than they already were? Better they stay focused on their jobs. Better they trust that Doc knew what he was doing. Even if Doc was making it up as he went along, same as everyone else. Stories like Holloway's don't survive in official after-action reports. They survive because people share them. If you served with armor in Vietnam, if you knew what it meant to button up and roll into terrain that belonged to the enemy, the comment section below isn't just a place to type. It's where these memories stay alive. His promise to Sarah would be tested in ways neither of them imagined when he shipped out. Senior Lieutenant Nguyen Van Thon of the Viet Cong's 5th Division had been fighting Americans for 3 years before most of Holloway's men graduated high school. He'd fought the French before that. At 37 years old, he'd survived longer than most men in his position survived. Not through luck, but through meticulous planning and the ability to learn from every engagement. He'd studied American armor tactics through 18 ambushes, 14 successful, 4 disasters. He understood what most of his commanders didn't. American cavalry could be beaten, but only if you committed to destroying them completely in the first 60 seconds. Half measures meant facing their firepower after they'd recovered from the initial shock. That meant dying. Thon respected the Americans. Not their cause. He believed they had no right to be in his country. But their tactical competence, their firepower, their refusal to quit even when quitting made sense. He'd watched American platoons fight their way out of situations that should have killed them all, watched them call in fire support that turned jungle into moonscape, watched them carry their wounded out under fire when leaving them would have been easier. They weren't cowards. They were professionals. That made them dangerous. His plan for Highway 13 had taken 6 weeks to prepare. 3 kilometers of road, carefully selected for terrain that limited American maneuver. Dense jungle on both sides, too thick for the M113s to push through. A slight curve that would force the column to slow. Concealed positions for 12 RPG teams, each with 3 rockets and a clear field of fire at track sides where armor was thinnest. Command-detonated mines at 3 points along the kill zone. Heavy machine guns positioned to rake the convoy from both ends, preventing escape forward or back. His men had rehearsed their positions at night, learned their fields of fire, established fallback routes. They'd prepared for American air support, American artillery, American reinforcements. They'd prepared for everything. What Thon couldn't prepare for was what happened when American cavalrymen decided that the only way out was through. when they stopped thinking about survival and started thinking about killing everyone who'd ambushed them. That mentality, that particular American combination of firepower and fury, was something no amount of planning could fully account for. For the Americans, losing Highway 13 meant more than tactical inconvenience. It meant supply convoys taking longer routes through even more dangerous terrain. It meant fire-based construction delayed. It meant questioning whether American armor could operate effectively in this environment. For Thon and his men, closing the highway meant proving the Americans couldn't protect their own supply lines, couldn't control territory beyond their bases, couldn't win a war where the enemy chose when and where to fight. Both sides understood the stakes went beyond this single engagement. For Holloway personally, the stakes were simpler and more complex. Bring his men through alive. Complete the mission. Don't be the lieutenant who lost an entire platoon because he made the wrong call in the wrong 3 seconds. He'd made a promise to Sarah, but he'd also made promises to 37 men who trusted him to know what he was doing. The strategic reality was brutally clear. If Blackhorse couldn't keep Highway 13 open, if armor proved vulnerable to well-planned ambushes, the entire American approach to operations in this theater would require rethinking. Macy V was watching. Hanoi was watching. And somewhere in that jungle, someone was counting on American cavalry doing exactly what cavalry always did, charging forward into the guns. I'll be direct about something. YouTube's algorithm buries military history content unless viewers actively engage. Every subscription, every like, tells the platform these stories deserve reach. If you're still watching, you already understand that honoring these men means remembering what they actually faced, not sanitized versions. Subscribe now. Hit that like button. Because what happened in the next 8 minutes would define whether armor had a future in this war, and whether 37 men had a future at all. The first RPG hit Holloway's command track 3 seconds after the jungle stopped being silent. Not the lead vehicle, not the trail, the command track, third in column, exactly where doctrine said the platoon commander should be. The shaped charge punched through the right side armor at a perfect 90-degree angle, the molten copper jet designed to turn the interior into a killing box. Holloway felt the impact before he heard it, a physical wall of pressure that threw him sideways into his RTO. Heat. Not fire yet, but heat that meant fire was coming. The smell of burning metal and something worse. The chemical stink of explosive mixed with diesel and something organic. Jenkins was screaming. Or maybe that was the radio. Or maybe that was Holloway himself. Sound returned all at once, not gradually. All at once. Automatic weapons fire from both sides. The distinctive crack thump of RPGs launching. The deeper boom of command-detonated mines. Explosions, screaming. The high-pitched whine of his own track's engine still running, even though half the crew compartment was open to daylight that shouldn't be there. His ears rang with a frequency that felt like it came from inside his skull. Blood on his hands. Not his. Jenkins. Jenkins was hit. Chest. Bad. The medical supplies were in the back. The back was on fire. Holloway's training said assess, report, react. His training didn't cover what to do when all three needed to happen in the same second. Through the smoke, he could see the lead track stopped, dead in the road. RPG through the engine compartment. Crew bailing out into fire from both sides of the highway. The trail vehicle was reversing, trying to back out of the kill zone. Wrong move. Mines behind them. Thon had planned for that. The explosion lifted the M113's rear off the ground, dropped it sideways across the road. Burning. Men inside. No time to think about men inside. Think later. Act now or die now. Thane's fighters had executed perfectly. The ambush had triggered exactly as planned, with the precision that came from weeks of rehearsal. American armor was burning. American soldiers were exposed. The heavy machine guns were pouring fire into the disabled vehicles, preventing crew from reorganizing. RPG teams were reloading for second shots. The Americans had 60 seconds, maybe less, before the kill zone became a graveyard. Thon had seen this before, seen Americans panic, seen them freeze, seen them try to dismount and fight on foot, which meant dying on foot. He'd seen everything except what happened next. Holloway's radio crackled, someone shouting, second platoon requesting permission to turn back, find another route. Third platoon reporting they were pinned, couldn't move forward or back. Everyone asking for orders. Everyone asking Doc what to do. The sound he'd heard 3 seconds before the ambush suddenly made sense. Not a sound. Silence. The jungle warning him. And he'd kept rolling anyway because turning back wasn't an option command would accept. The photo of Sarah had come loose from the dashboard, was lying in the pooling diesel fuel at his feet. 3 months until his rotation date. 3 months until he went home to Amarillo and tried to become someone she'd recognize again. Jenkins was still screaming. The radio was still demanding orders. The fire was spreading from the crew compartment toward the fuel tanks, and Holloway realized he had exactly one choice that didn't end with body bags and Medal of Honor ceremonies for dead men. He keyed the radio. His voice came out steady somehow. Not calm, but steady. All tracks, don't stop, don't reverse. Full throttle forward through the kill zone. Stay in column. Return fire everything. Repeat. Forward. Through. Now. The response was immediate disbelief, then acknowledgement. Because Doc had brought them through 23 patrols. Because they trusted him. Because there was no other choice left. That sound 3 seconds before the first RPG? He finally understood. It was the jungle itself holding its breath before violence. It was Thon's men settling into their firing positions with the discipline of professionals. It was the wire being connected to the command-detonated mines. It was the moment before everything changed. For approximately 90 seconds, it almost worked. The ambush had succeeded. American armor was burning. American soldiers were dying. Thon's fighters had done everything right. The plan was perfect. The execution was flawless. And then the Americans stopped acting like ambushed prey and started acting like something Thon had seen before but hoped never to see again. American cavalry that had decided survival meant going forward through the guns. Holloway's track lurched forward, diesel smoke pouring from the damaged engine compartment. The driver, Specialist Morrison, 19 years old from Philadelphia, had the accelerator floored, despite fire spreading toward his position. The 50 cal was hammering, Sergeant Davis traversing across both sides of the highway, not aiming at specific targets but saturating everything with suppressive fire. The entire column was moving now, not retreating, not stopping. Charging forward into the ambush at full speed. Jenkins was still conscious somehow. Holloway had his hand pressed against the chest wound, blood pulsing between his fingers. The proper procedure was stop the vehicle, render aid, call for medevac. The proper procedure meant staying in the kill zone where RPGs were still incoming. What would you do? Not theoretically. Right now. Your driver is 30 seconds from burning alive. Your RTO is bleeding out under your hands. The enemy is reloading. Command is demanding a sitrep. Your wife's photo is covered in diesel and blood. You have three options: stop and render aid while taking fire, keep moving and let Jenkins bleed out, or do something that violates every rule you were taught. He chose the third option. Hollowed into the crew compartment. "Sergeant Ramirez, take Jenkins. Keep him breathing." Then to Morrison, "Don't stop for anything, anything." Then to Davis on the 50. "Switch to the M60, close range. Crew-served weapons in the tree line. Kill them all." The M113s were designed for 12 miles per hour cross-country. They were doing 20 on Highway 13. Engines screaming, tracks throwing up dirt and debris, every vehicle firing everything they had. Not suppressive fire anymore. Murder fire. The kind that turned jungle into shredded vegetation and body parts. Thon's carefully prepared positions were being overrun by vehicles that should have been destroyed but refused to die. Thing saw his plan disintegrating in real time. The Americans weren't reacting like they were supposed to. They weren't stopping to recover casualties. They weren't trying to fight from the vehicles. They were doing the one thing his plan hadn't fully prepared for, accepting casualties and pushing through with the kind of momentum that turned an ambush into a meeting engagement. His RPG teams were reloading, but the targets were moving too fast now, hull down behind their own smoke and dust. His machine gun positions were taking direct fire from the American .50 caliber and M60s. Men were dying. His men. Good men who'd done everything right and were dying anyway because the Americans had stopped caring about proper tactics and started caring only about killing everyone who'd shot at them. The promise Holloway had made to Sarah was breaking in real time. Bring everyone home. But Jenkins was dying despite Ramirez's desperate attempts at first aid. Private Chen in the second track had taken shrapnel when the RPG hit. Corporal Williams in fourth track was unconscious from the initial mine blast. The promise was impossible. It had always been impossible. But he'd made it anyway, because that's what you tell the person you love when you ship out to a war you don't understand. You tell them you'll come home. You don't tell them you might come home missing pieces of yourself that never grow back. That photograph of Sarah, now stained with Jenkins's blood, represented everything he was fighting for and everything he was losing simultaneously. 3 months. Just 3 more months. And now this. Now a choice between going home having done his duty or going home having kept his men alive. Those weren't the same thing. They'd never been the same thing. But he'd spent 4 months pretending they were. The turning point came when Morrison's track broke through the southern end of the kill zone, and Holloway saw what Thon hadn't anticipated. Open ground, 500 meters of rice paddy between the highway and the jungle sanctuary. Thon's fallback plan required his men to fade into dense vegetation, using the jungle itself as defense. But open ground meant something different. It meant American armor could maneuver. It meant cavalry could do what cavalry was designed to do. Holloway keyed the radio. His voice came through steady, almost calm, the voice of someone who'd stopped calculating odds and started accepting outcomes. All tracks, online formation, sweep the tree line. Anyone who shot at us is still there. Find them. Kill them. The transformation from column to line took 40 seconds. 6 M113 spreading across the rice paddy, maintaining interval, every weapon pointed at the jungle edge where Thon's forces were repositioning. This was what the VC had feared. This was why the ambush needed to destroy the Americans in the first 60 seconds, because after that, if they survived, American firepower and American radios turned Hunter into prey. Thon understood immediately what was happening. His ambush had succeeded tactically but failed strategically. He'd hurt the Americans. He'd probably killed some, but he hadn't stopped them. And now they were doing what American units did when they stopped trying to survive and started trying to revenge. They were bringing everything. Artillery fire support was incoming. He could hear the helicopters, gunships, medevac, reinforcements. The window for withdrawal was closing. His men were brave. They were skilled. But they couldn't fight armor and helicopters and artillery simultaneously. The Americans had a saying Thon had learned from captured documents. If you're going through hell, keep going. He'd never understood it until now, until he watched burning American vehicles refuse to stop, watched wounded Americans keep fighting, watched a lieutenant who should have been calling for medevac instead calling for fire support on his own position to kill the people who'd ambushed him. Holloway's .50 caliber found an RPG team reloading in the tree line. Davis was methodical, professional. The same professionalism Thon's men had shown in setting up the ambush. War wasn't personal. It was just professional men killing other professional men with skill and courage on both sides, and God help anyone who thought there was honor in it beyond the honor of doing your job well. The artillery arrived first. Fire Support Base Apache, 8 clicks north, had been monitoring the radio traffic. The first volley of 105 shells impacted 200 meters beyond the tree line, walking back toward the highway in proper adjustment. Thon's men were already moving, fading deeper into the jungle, carrying their wounded, leaving behind prepared positions that had cost weeks to establish. The Americans had paid in blood, but so had the VC, and the VC couldn't call in helicopters to evacuate their casualties. Morrison's track was still running somehow. The engine fire had gone out on its own, starved of fuel when a line ruptured. Jenkins was still breathing. Barely. Ramirez had kept pressure on the wound through the entire charge, had probably saved his life. Would probably receive a medal he'd never wear because medals reminded you of people who didn't make it. It wasn't about firepower, Holloway realized as artillery continued to pound the jungle. It was about refusing to quit when quitting was the only logical choice. It was about 37 men who trusted each other more than they trusted tactics or doctrine or proper procedure. It was about Morrison keeping the accelerator down while fire spread toward his position. It was about Davis staying on the .50 caliber instead of bailing out. It was about Ramirez choosing to save Jenkins instead of saving himself. What had been decided on Highway 13 wasn't decided by strategy or superior technology. It was decided by men who'd already accepted they might die and chose to take the other side with them if that's how it ended. Thon understood that. His men understood that. Both sides recognized professional respect for the other's courage even while trying to kill each other. That's what war looked like when stripped of propaganda and politics. Professional men doing violent work with skill and accepting the cost. Private First Class David Jenkins from Columbus, Ohio, died in the medevac helicopter 17 minutes after liftoff. He was 20 years old. He'd been in country for 3 months. He'd joined the Army because his father had served in World War II. And he wanted to understand what his father never talked about. Now his father would understand why some things don't translate. Holloway had held pressure on that chest wound for 8 minutes, had kept him conscious, had promised him he'd make it. Another promise broken. Jenkins' last words were asking about Morrison. Whether Morrison got out okay. Morrison had gotten out okay, with second-degree burns on both forearms but alive. Specialist Robert Morrison from Philadelphia survived. Sergeant James Davis from Detroit survived. Corporal Miguel Ramirez from El Paso survived. 29 men from Holloway's platoon made it through the ambush. 8 didn't. 8 men whose names Holloway would recite every morning for the next 40 years, whose faces he'd see when anyone asked him about Vietnam, whose families would receive telegrams and folded flags and explanations that sounded noble but felt hollow. The Viet Cong losses were harder to count. Thon's after-action report, recovered years later when records were declassified, listed 14 killed, 19 wounded. American estimates put it higher. Body counts were unreliable. What mattered was that Thon's unit had been forced to abandon a prepared position, had lost operational capacity for 2 months while rebuilding, had failed to close Highway 13. He'd survived. Most of his men survived, but the objective, proving American armor was vulnerable, had been complicated by American armor proving it was harder to kill than the plan accounted for. The battlefield after action looked like what war actually looked like when the propaganda photography was finished. Burning vehicles, shredded jungle, shell craters, blood-stained earth that would grow rice again next season because war was temporary but farming was forever. The jungle had absorbed worse. It would absorb this. The question was whether the men who'd fought there could absorb it the same way. Holloway stood beside Morrison's track 3 hours after the ambush, after the medevacs had lifted out, after the recovery vehicles had arrived, after command had taken his initial report. The photo of Sarah was still there, still stained with Jenkins's blood. He picked it up carefully. The paper was partly burned where diesel had soaked it. Her face was still visible, smiling, unaware that the man she'd married was being replaced by someone else wearing his name. Someone who'd made choices that saved lives by spending other lives. Someone who understood now why his father never talked about Korea. The weight wasn't physical. Holloway hadn't been wounded. No Purple Heart. No visible scars. The weight was knowing that Jenkins died because Holloway chose to keep moving instead of stopping to render aid. The weight was knowing that choice was correct tactically and devastating personally. The weight was understanding that Morrison burned his arms because Holloway ordered him to keep driving. That Ramirez would have nightmares about chest wounds and arterial blood for decades. That all of them, the ones who lived, were paying costs that would come due in installments for the rest of their lives. Sergeant Davis approached quietly. Davis, who'd stayed on the .50 caliber when bailing out, would have been safer. Davis, who'd killed at least 6 VC fighters at close range. Davis, who was 23 years old and would never sleep through a thunderstorm again because thunder sounded like RPGs. Sir, the men wanted me to tell you. You made the right call. Pushing through. We'd all be dead if we'd stopped. Davis paused. Jenkins knew that. He told Ramirez. Said Doc would get us through. Another pause. He was right, sir. Holloway wanted to believe that. Wanted to accept that sometimes the right tactical decision meant accepting casualties you might have prevented with a different choice. Wanted to understand that command meant making those calculations and living with them. But Jenkins's last words, asking about Morrison, kept echoing. Not asking about himself, asking about his friend. That's what they were, not a platoon, not a unit. Friends who die asking about each other's safety before their own. The smell stayed with him. Not cordite, not diesel, something worse. Something that made his throat close 40 years later when he'd smell anything similar. The smell of burning metal and flesh and jungle and diesel all mixed together. The smell of Highway 13. The smell of choices that couldn't be unmade. Days turned to weeks. Weeks turned to months. Holloway rotated home 3 months later, exactly on schedule. He'd completed his tour. He'd earned his Combat Infantryman badge, his Bronze Star, his Air Medal for the helicopter ride back to base that day. He'd done his duty honorably, but the weight never got lighter. It just became familiar, something he carried the way Morrison still carried scars on his forearms, the way Davis carried hypervigilance, the way Ramirez carried the knowledge of what arterial blood felt like pulsing between your fingers while you're begging God to let this one live. Michael Holloway spent 43 years living with Highway 13 before he finally told the whole story. Not to Sarah, though they stayed married, and she learned to recognize when he was back there, learned to wake him gently from nightmares, learned that some questions don't have answers worth hearing. Not to therapists, though he tried twice, before realizing that explaining combat to someone who'd never experienced it was like explaining color to someone born blind. He told it to Robert Morrison in 2009 at a reunion of Blackhorse veterans in Colorado Springs, where old men with young men's ghosts in their eyes gathered to remember friends who never got old. Morrison still had the scars, wore long sleeves even in summer. He'd become a machinist after discharge, married a woman who understood he needed space sometimes, raised 2 daughters who learned not to slam doors because sudden sounds made their father flinch. He told Holloway something that night that changed how Holloway understood that day on Highway 13. "I knew we were probably going to die when you gave the order to push through, but I also knew that stopping meant dying for certain. You gave us a chance, Doc. That's all anyone could do. Give us a chance." James Davis had struggled more. PTSD diagnosis in 1976, before the military fully acknowledged what that meant. Alcohol problems, divorce, bankruptcy. He'd put a gun in his mouth in 1983 and couldn't pull the trigger because he kept hearing Morrison asking if he was okay, kept hearing Holloway's voice on the radio giving orders that saved their lives. He got help after that, worked with veterans organizations, helped younger combat veterans understand they weren't crazy. They were injured, and injuries could heal if you let them. Miguel Ramirez became a physician assistant, specialized in trauma surgery. Said he spent 30 years trying to save people the way he couldn't quite save Jenkins. He had Jenkins's mother's address, wrote her every year on the anniversary, told her David had died asking about his friends, told her David's last act was being worried about someone else's safety, told her things the telegram from the Department of Defense never mentioned because official notifications don't capture how someone died asking about the people he loved. The 8 who didn't make it never got 43 years, never got marriages or children or careers, or the slow process of turning combat into memory and memory into something manageable. They got telegrams delivered to addresses in Columbus and Atlanta and Los Angeles and small towns whose names mean nothing to people who didn't grow up there. They got funerals with rifle salutes and folded flags. They got headstones in Arlington and local cemeteries and family plots. They got remembered by the men who survived and the families who didn't. Holloway served honorably. His men served honorably. Senior Lieutenant Nguyen Van Than and his fighters, those young men on the other side who planned that ambush with skill and executed it with courage, they served honorably too. They all did what they believed was right, with courage and professionalism that deserves recognition regardless of which flag they fought under. War creates heroes on all sides. It also creates tragedies on all sides. The courage of one doesn't diminish the courage of the other. Both can be true. Both should be remembered. The fault, when there was fault, lay in strategy and policy, in decisions made in Washington and Hanoi by people who would never walk Highway 13, never feel RPGs hitting armor, Never hold pressure on a chest wound while ordering someone else to keep driving. The soldiers did their part. The question that haunted Holloway for 43 years was whether the leaders did theirs, whether the objective was worth the cost, whether Highway 13 remaining open for 3 more months before the war ended anyway justified what happened to Jenkins and Morrison and Davis and Ramirez and 8 men who never came home. The photograph of Sarah, still stained with Jenkins's blood, stayed in Holloway's wallet until he died in 2012. He'd never cleaned it, never replaced it. Told Sarah once that he kept it because it reminded him that some promises can't be kept perfectly, but have to be kept anyway. You promise to bring everyone home, but 8 don't make it. You promise to come home unchanged, but you come home carrying ghosts. You promise, and you break promises, and you live with what you did because the alternative is giving up, and the men you served with deserved better than watching you give up. If you served or knew someone who served, their sacrifice was real. Their courage was real. The choices they made under impossible conditions were real. Subscribe and join those who refuse to forget. Share this story if you believe these experiences matter. And remember, honor the warriors, question the wars, because Highway 13 is just asphalt and dirt now. But the weight of what happened there is still being carried by men who were young once and are old now, and will never fully leave that jungle regardless of how many years pass.